Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I'm Michael Ettlinger. I direct the Carsey School of Public Policy here at the University of New Hampshire. I'm reaching you from our palatial offices. So I thought I'd start by just saying a couple things about why we decided this would be a good idea to have this conversation. It actually, for me, it was sort of, I think the very first spark was actually an email that was sent to the UNH campus by university's president last year, calling for civil dialogue, as we navigated differences. The whole country was navigating and still is navigating differences on some, in some very divisive times. And it kind of got me actually thinking back to my days on a college campus when I was involved in the anti-apartheid movement and protesting US support of military dictatorships in Central America. And I was just reflecting on choices me and the people I was working with made back then, and whether they were the right choices, the wrong choices, specifically about choices we made when we thought that words weren't enough, that we needed more than talk to make our point. And that just, and it's broader than campuses, and it's broader than one email from a university president, with the Black Lives Matters protests that were sort of overwhelmingly nonviolent, but which in places rose to violence. There was the events of January 6th. There's a lot of just people questioning, how we should behave when there's some change we want to make or something that in society that we think needs to be addressed. The other thing more recently, I think it was just this past week, NPR had a story about a poll that was done that found that 1 in 5 Republican men didn't just think that violence in government was ever justified. They thought 1 in 5 Republican men thought violence against government was justified right now. And that overall 1 in 10 of people in the country felt that way. Also found that 1 in 4 thought, in the abstract, sometimes violence against government was appropriate. And people were making a big deal about that. I found that a little less striking just because, the country was founded in violence against government. So, but what was more striking was that people thought right now it was justified in the numbers that there were. So, I think the bottom line is that the country is clearly divided on what is appropriate and allowable as we seek various kinds of change that we favor. So we thought that was a good topic to have a conversation about. So, and we gathered this excellent panel of people to talk about it, and I'm going to introduce them and then we'll get into it. First of all, we have Nancy Thomas, who is, excuse me, Nancy is the director of the Institute for Democracy and Higher Education at the Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts University. She's been a strong voice for democratic practices on campus. I should say that's a small d democratic. Her work and scholarship interests include college student civic learning and participation in democracy, campus climates for political engagement, deliberative democracy, political equity and inclusion, and campus free speech and academic freedom. So you can see how her interests and work align well with our topic. She has a doctorate in education and a law degree. Michele Holt-Shannon is the director and co-founder of New Hampshire Listens here at the Carsey School at UNH. Hi, Michele. She works on and off campus to bring people together across perspectives and backgrounds to solve problems and to create equitable solutions for their communities, often around highly contentious topics. And last but not least, we have Jamaal Downey, who is the lead instructor of the Treat Student Fellowship at New Hampshire Listens here at the Carsey School. He is a father, writer, teacher, has his PhD in language literacy and culture from UMass Amherst, and he's engaged in postdoctoral research at the University of Florida. His personal story and academic interests converge around identity, language, ideology, and consciousness, pedagogy, and epistemology, and is focused on solving dire issues in higher education and supporting students through critical and interdisciplinary thinking, coupled with culturally sustaining and humanizing pedagogies. So I think it's kind of self-evident why we thought all of these people had something to contribute to this conversation. Just to tell you what the plan is, we're going to talk amongst the four of us for a bit, and then we'll go to breakout rooms to give you all a chance to engage, and then we'll reconvene. And just one housekeeping note I should tell you is that while the four of us are having this conversation to kick things off, that's being recorded, but the recording will stop once we go into the breakout rooms. So with that throat clearing, if you will, I'll start by just asking for some initial thoughts from each of you, on your take on the question we're addressing and, how it relates to your work. And maybe Nancy, you could kick us off.
Sure. So hi, everybody. Happy to be here. I love the University of New Hampshire. I used to work there, worked with Michele and Bruce Mallory. So hello to familiar territory. As Michael said, I run this research institute at Tufts University. It's an institute that you may know because we do send you your campus voting reports. So I often say to audiences that I have X-ray vision and know an awful lot about you because I know what % of the students vote. And while that might sound extreme, it actually is a reflection on student political engagement. And we started this study in 2013, and things have absolutely exponentially jumped in the way of student interest in activism, in issues, in voting. And I think it's such an opportunity for higher education. So I'm here because my background is actually in deliberative democracy. And I think that the question on the table is this a time for polite civil discourse? What are the threats that democracy or society is facing? And do we have the tools to address those threats? And is public deliberation or dialogue or discussion or conversation, whatever language you choose to use, is that the right approach right now in this political and historical moment?
Thank you. How about Jamaal? Why don't you jump in?
Hello, everybody. Excited to be here with these amazing scholars and more than anything, wonderful and beautiful people. I'm here because I have a special knack for dialogue, right? What it means to better understand the other, how we can better understand ourselves in relation to societal and social constructs, and how we do engage. And my life as a biracial man has allowed me to straddle several different spheres regularly and try to engage in language in and around. I'm one of those not always one things. It can be an and or both, or what about, but I can absolutely respect the need for instant change, the release valve that needs to happen in certain moments. And so I'm excited to engage with these amazing people on ways that we can get there. Is it an and or? Does it matter? When does it matter? And these are things that we discuss regularly in my own lives. Yes, we're those boring people that at the dinner table we talk about, just the other night it was posed, well, what big societal and social change has happened without a riot or some kind of protest? And we thought about it. It was a no Google table. So we thought about it, and it was just I advise everybody to do that, ask questions and try not to instantly hop on your phone. It's quite fun. From back in my day, and I'm sure my colleagues. But just in general, how do we get there? What is needed? When is it? And as we discussed this panel before, I myself haven't engaged in too many protests, right? For pretty selfish reasons, my own identity in such a white area. I feel like I might stick out like a coffee bean amongst a sea of salt. So I try to pick and choose where I engage, how I engage in the most strategic form for myself and for my community and other communities that I'm advocating for.
Michele.
Yeah, no, it's great to hear a little more from Nancy and Jamaal. I co-founded and run a equity and engagement organization, and it's deeply grounded in dialogue. And so I'm really here as a applied doer dialogue person. Over the years, we've worked on almost every topic that I can think of: water sustainability, a dangerous intersection, mental health, a racist incident. And we host learning exchanges, cross-sector gatherings, multi-sector, stakeholder events and coalitions, and just help people pay attention to fairness and structure and authentic engagement. And I always joke that I'm a middle child, so I'm like, okay, well, let's just see who can talk to each other, and what can we figure out. But it is fraught. It is fraught with who's willing to talk to who and when and why. And so it's something that I think about pretty regularly and also grapple with. And so I think that one of the things that I was excited to be a part of this panel for is just to think about and clarify some of my own values, like why do I choose to do what I do in the space that I'm in, and I think that the folks who joined us today, it's also something to think about. It's like, what works for you, what works for your organization, what feels like it's your work to do. And so I feel like there is sort of an ethic around it. And some of it's personal, but some of it's systemic. And so I hope that we get to dig at some of that.
Thanks, Michele. So one question that arises in the real world for those who are trying to seek change, it's to some extent, people just react, and they sort of, it's not necessarily well thought out whether they engage, what kind of activities they engage in to try to make change happen. But there's also a more measured, just strategic question, like if you want to make change, what do you do? And I'm going to call on Jamaal first, just because he brought up, that conversation you had, has there ever been change without a riot? And, I think I first smelled tear gas when I was 12 years old at an anti-Vietnam War thing my parents brought me to. So, I'm a little more steeped in that tradition. But like, what conclusion did you guys come to, Jamaal?
I'm really big on dialogue and wanting to understand, and I'm not a sit on your hands kind of person. Again, there's a time and place for everything, but it was really difficult to think of what social change has occurred without some major uprising. Like we struggled, and even without the facts, even without good examples, I still was like, but not really knowing. And even in the town that I live in, and we're in New Hampshire, there was the Pine Tree Riots in 1772 about, big mast poles being stamped with the British stamp and only allowing, the royal people to chop them down. And like, that was the thing. It wasn't, they didn't talk their way through it. They didn't dialogue through it. It was a major uprising. People got put down, troops were sent in. And it was, again, I'm a talk guy. I want to better understand. I want to dialogue these things through and try to figure out a point. But we didn't come up with any, at least not solely just dialogue. There were issues or moments where we were thinking that it's dialogue along with protest, and not necessarily riots, but an uprising, a simmering down of boil over of aggravation and anger into a level of dialogue and better understanding what comes next. But just simply talking, that's 0.0, unfortunately, right? Unfortunately.
So maybe Nancy, and also, one thing you mentioned, how you measure like how student voting, there's also just voting, right, as a way to make change, because in the end, that's a big way to convey power to people who will make change. So maybe you could work that into the equation too, Nancy.
Sure. So obviously, if we vote them out of office, that's power. Democracy, at least in theory, is a system of self-governance. I have this little slide I should flash up to you all. It's a picture of the LA freeway with 4 cars in 4 lanes in one direction, 4 in the other, all at a standstill. And there's a billboard over it and says, you don't like the traffic, you are the traffic. And so theoretically, that's what our democracy is. And if we don't like the way things are, then we should organize, or we should protest, or we should organize dialogues and talk to each other, or we should bring lawsuits, or I can think of lots of ways that change happens in our country. And, when thinking about where dialogue fits in, maybe we weave in and out of some of these approaches. I think that there are a couple of challenges, though, and that is, well, what if the social movement is negative? Can we point to a dialogue behind the white nationalist groups? It's funny, Jamaal, ever since you brought up what you're talking about at the dinner table, now my mind is completely there. And I'm thinking, okay, well, what about teenage smoking? That's bad. How about the Beatles? That's good. So I think there's some catalyst or something that gets things moving, and what those some things are vary. And I think right now we have a nation that is very moved by disinformation, and we have a nation that is moved by charismatic leaders. I remember when my son was in elementary school, and he was constantly getting sent down to the principal's office, and then I'd be hauled in, and the principal had this little card, and in the 4 corners were the attributes of each student, and one was positive leader and the other was negative leader. If he's listening, sorry kid, you've turned out all right. But my point is that we have things that catalyze change. We have incidents such as George Floyd. I think that his devastating murder has really catalyzed some action, which is exciting. And then what is the role of leadership? And then I think, more to the point, if we want to prepare our students to be the change agents in a system of self-governance, how do we do that? So those are just a few thoughts. I do think dialogue has an enormous role to play. And my suspicion is it weaves in and out of all of the catalytic forces and actions.
Did you want to chime in on this, Michele?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think when you're making a decision as a social change person of what role and when for dialogue, I mean, that's the crux of the issue for me, because we grapple on a regular basis with whether or not the time is right to encourage dialogue. It's the what and the when, I think, is really critical. The who is almost always you need a mix, a mix of people and people who are impacted by a decision. But what needs to benefit from talking is a big decision for us, and dialogue has been used to delay change. It absolutely has been used to delay change, and we know that. And so there's no question, when you look back in history, people who are being hurt are also being asked to slow down and talk it out. So then how do you and yet I totally believe in what I do. So it's really about, like, when do you and who are you asking to lean in, right, into the conversation. I definitely feel like, well, we'll talk about this more, because I know we're going to talk about, like, who would you never talk to and who would you talk to. But I think that change comes from the bottom up, the top down, the outside in, the inside out. I mean, I feel like it comes from every direction, and it's never just one of those directions. And I'd love to know. I'm not a historian. I'm fascinated and I read, but I'm curious about Jamal's dinner table conversation too, and all the examples of sort of the marching, the kind of iconic protests, right? The, laying in the streets or whatever, we've seen, and then protests that were kind of like shenanigans. So in New Hampshire, we have this great story about fighting for civil unions, civil rights for gay and lesbian people, marriage equity. And there's this whole story, I won't go into it, but you can find it on the UNH website, about bidding on a breakfast, a pancake breakfast with the governor, who had been ignoring their requests. And so that's a different kind of disruption, right? It's like you're not playing the game how they wanted you to play it, but there's no violence, and it's kind of creative, actually. So I just think that when I think about change happening all over, there's no doubt though that the sacrifice is felt most keenly at the root, and by the people being impacted. And I have some more thoughts about that, but I'll pause for now. So.
Yeah, no, interesting. I guess, we've referenced power a lot here. And I actually think I would just chime in one thing briefly, which is to Jamal's dinner. I can think of things where change has happened without a riot that have been pretty important to society. I can't personally think of things where it's involved the giving up of power, though, or the transferring of power. I use in a class I teach the example of, Ralph Nader wrote this book in 1962 called Unsafe at Any Speed, which sort of created the whole, because of that, it sort of just brought something to people's attention, how automobiles were incredibly and unnecessarily unsafe, and galvanized a whole movement to address that, which galvanized a whole product safety movement, right? Which is actually, we all take it for granted, and it's like just in part of it, it was like a really, really big deal. And there was resistance. The companies that made the automobiles, that power structure was, highly resistant, not just automobiles, but consumer products in general, was highly resistant to that change. But it happened, as far as I can recall, without mass protests or violent, or sit-ins or anything, just because people became aware of it and became politically necessary to address it. So, I think.
So we have seat belts now. We used to rattle around in the back.
Well, we have more than seat. It's more than that. But I don't want to trivialize it by just, not that seatbelts are trivial, but it's like, anyway, so I'm just like, I think there are examples of that where we sort of learn more as a society, and we actually do make change, even against resistance from powerful forces. But I can't think of any example that it more concretely involves like a real shifting of who has power in the way maybe you would describe more as a social movement. But anyway.
Michael, can I ask a question to follow up on that just real quick? So there's power, but then there's also authority. And I guess I think of social change as coming from people with and without positional authority.
Yeah.
So I think it's a distinction that, here's a word we'll probably overuse, is empowering. I don't think you need positional authority to make social change. I think that's what you will bump up against, however, is power that rests with people with positional authority.
Well, let me ask you about that. So that relates to some stuff I wanted to get to, which is, can you give me an example where ultimately you don't need what's an example of something where you can make what you're defining as social change happen without ultimately getting someone with authority to act? Do you ultimately need authority to ultimately, don't you, I mean, I think that's a great distinction between power and authority, but do you ultimately need some power over someone with authority to act to accomplish your goals?
I think it depends on whether you're talking about systems or institutional change or culture.
Yeah.
And I don't think you need power or positional authority to change culture. And I think, in fact, that brings us back to the topic of dialogue, because that's one of the great things about it is if you really want embedded, deep, permanent, sustainable change, you got to change culture. And that's one of the beauties of deliberative processes. But if you run up against corrupt institutions or unethical people in positions of power, or abuses of power by our systems that are in place, even the democratically elected officials who abuse their power, then you got to wonder if the system works. But in my mind, we can act to change culture with or without positional authority, and with culture change, hopefully will come systemic and institutional change.
So by the way, if any of the audience has a question or something that they'd like us to introduce, please put it in the chat. I can't guarantee you that I will, as I multitask, pick up on it, but we have someone who's supposed to be doing that. So hopefully we'll get to it. So don't take it personally if I don't get to something you put in there, but I would encourage you to do it. Not we're trying to keep an eye on it.
Well, I wanted to chime in on kind of a little bit about what Nancy was saying in the power piece, and I think I saw Jamaal wanted to jump into just that. I mean, one of the reasons I will strategically, want to trot out dialogue as part of a change process is to bring as many people as possible into the bigger tent of something good and forward moving, that needs to happen or change. And that's knowing that there may be, unethical people or folks who want bad things to happen. There's sort of this humanity of thinking, okay, I think most people, want good things to happen. And so how do you invite people into that tent? And in terms of the power piece, for me, it's like, we have when we have some form of power, we are unlikely to see the wrong that's happening below us, right? So like, when I was in 10th grade, I knew the 11th and 12th graders, but I didn't know any 9th graders. Like, I didn't really care about them. They didn't have power in the social system, right? And so there is something about the view, you look up, to the powers above you, and you don't look down as much, to the, I'm using the hierarchy, but I think that unawareness, the need for proximity to hear somebody's story that you had no clue about, some of that is time spent in dialogue.
So Jamaal, did you have something you wanted to?
Yeah, and also a big difference that I'm noticing is that dialogue, while more sustaining, it takes way longer. It reminds me of being an educator, right? I so often plant seeds and I don't get to see the tree grow. I so bad want to, but I've given up that need for instant gratification. Well, when we're talking about societal and social change, the delayed gratification, there's real lives at stake in between there. Right? There's real people at stake. And so what do? We just say, you're just casual or collateral damage until we get to where we are. So I can see the need for and or both, because yes, while I can teach future senators and presidents and, start to plant those seeds and create change long-term, they're still my son that's going to be going through the system in the in-between. And what do I do? Tell them, yeah, too bad, sorry, you're just going to have to deal with it and wait for the next generation, right? So I can appreciate that need for the instant gratification and change of riots or protests and getting that. But this discussion on power has reminded me of a quote from C.L.R. James in his Black Jacobins, where he says, people with power don't give up power without a plan to take back power. right? So it's one of those, when you do feel that power is being released to you, I don't want to say be weary, but be optimistically or cautiously optimistic about understanding why they're giving up power, for how long, how they plan on taking it back, and just being mindful, because you might get the crumbs off of their plate, but you're not invited to the table, right? So how do you understand power in that relation? And for me, power is the elephant in the room that we see, but we don't see, but we do, but we don't, right? So there's a lot of these things bubbling, but definitely sustained change takes so much longer, and it is planting that seed. But what do we say to all the people in the in-between?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just to kind of disaggregate, we're using power in multiple ways. And I like Nance's distinction of authority, institutional authority of some sort, because there's all sorts of power. There's sort of moral power. There's the power of the people on the street protesting. There's there's power in numbers because people will vote. There's sort of the power to get attention and to embarrass people. I mean, power comes from all power outside of institutional authority comes from all sources. And it seems to me like, to a large degree, what we're talking about is, and it gets back to Michele's point about timing, that if you enter into a dialogue before you bring some form of power to the table, you're probably not going to get a good outcome, because there's no reason for anybody to, if it's a conflict, if there's some conflict and disagreement, why would they do what you want them to if they disagree with you, unless you bring some sort of power to the table? And that power could be, moral authority can be a power, right? I mean, it can be that, or it can be the power to generate votes to hurt people in authority, or it can be the power to galvanize, marches on the streets, which embarrass them or cause them some problem. So it seems at the end there does need to be some power, but I do think Michele's point also touched on, when we talk about civility, the people who have the power will always want civility and will always want dialogue as an alternative to the other things I just listed. Because dialogue, you can filibuster, you can talk forever, right? You can sort of talk something to death. We did have a question I wanted to get to. So we have the question: doesn't changing culture involve changing dominant narratives about what is good and possible, and challenging the dominant narrative of people whose power is protected by it? Anyone want to grab on that one? I think it's an interesting question.
Can you repeat it?
Yes, it's in the chat if you want to look. But doesn't changing culture involve changing dominant narratives about what is good and possible, and challenging the dominant narrative of people whose power is protected by it? I mean, I take that as meaning, like, if everyone I mean, I'm not sure always, but it's certainly true that if there's just an accepted norm and no one's challenging the norm, that can define outcomes. And you really need to get at the norm or the narrative in order to even get into a conversation about change.
Yeah, I can speak to this a little bit because I work a lot in counter narratives and trying to not necessarily push back against, but show another side of things. And this is why I say dialogue takes so much time. It takes, you're planting the seeds, you're watering the soil, you're trying to make those things right, but you can't stick a horse's head underwater, right? You can just literally put all of the tools around and allow them to hopefully come to their own realization of it, that it will then be sustained versus being told what is right or wrong. But having worked with counter narratives, it's a laborious process that takes a lot of change, and there's lots of fumbling, there's lots of explanatory notes, there's lots of, and I, as a person of color, have to expend that emotional labor to do that regularly, which is regularly discounted, not seen, as part of my existence, where, and in a grumbling way, a lot of people get to just live and operate, right? Get force-fed this food, right? Just a thought.
Yeah, one thing you sort of keep saying dialogue takes a long time. It's not like protests always instantly, it may feel more gratifying to be out marching, but it's not like they produce instant results either. So, I think there's sort of an arc of change that can
I think
involve
both are
protest
faster.
What?
I think both are faster, meaning
Yeah,
the
well-
combination, like when our phone rings at New Hampshire Listens, it's usually, people will say things like everybody's fighting on Facebook, or, there's been some conflict, and that's why people are motivated to come to the table to talk, because they're trying to, address that conflict. And when there are people who, are sending, letters with demands, or, marching, or, whatever the protest side of the coin is, it's much more motivating to then have a conversation. But you're trying, that's where for me, you're trying to figure out, is it time yet? Is this going to take away, is this just about smoothing things out and making conflict go away? Or are we actually, going to make a step forward? I mean, I do feel like eventually, once the smoke clears and there's, people decide to come to the table, you have to have dialogue. Like, show me where it didn't happen and progress, came. It's a timing thing sometimes.
Well, even the American Revolution didn't end until the Treaty of Paris was negotiated, so there had to be dialogue at some point. I want to turn, before we go to the breakouts, I did want to turn to a couple of, somewhat more specific examples and questions. One is, I mentioned at the beginning, sort of, I was reflecting on my experiences in when I was sort of, particularly in college, given that we're in a college environment. So I'm going to tell you one specific story and get your reaction, which is, so the university I went to had a board of trustees, and the board of trustees alternated their meetings between in New York City and the main campus, which was 5 hours away. And the board was meeting in New York City, and they were deciding on whether the university should divest from companies that did business in South Africa, which was a big thing. It was a big movement to try to get universities to take their endowment funds out of companies that invested in South Africa, unless South Africa rid itself of apartheid. And the board of trustees voted to divest in their meeting in New York City. And the board of trustees had 2 student members and 1 university staff member. And the meeting was on a weekend, and late Sunday, after all the business was ostensibly gone, except for some little, technical stuff at the end, the 2 students and the staff member, the main campus where they had to be in school and work the next day on the main campus, which was 5 hours away. And so they left the meeting a little early, thinking all the business was done. The board re-voted, it had been a close vote, and voted against divestment. So we were pissed off, those of us who were doing it. And the next board meeting, which was on campus, we found out where the board was meeting, which they tried to keep secret because they knew we were going to do something. And we surrounded the building that they were meeting in. And we didn't let them out for all day. And so they didn't get their lunch, and a few of them missed their flights out, I think. And so, we didn't beat on anybody. We didn't break any windows or anything. There was a little violence when they tried to break out, and we wouldn't let them, but no one was seriously injured. But, that was like, we made a determination that we tried to play by the rules in their board of trustees meeting and gathering votes. And at that point, we gave up. It's like, okay, that ain't going to work. And then I graduated, whatever. Eventually, they did divest, but it was years later, and it was a lot more activism, protest, occupying buildings, and all that kind of thing. So, okay, I just is what we did, which, probably was technically kidnapping, it was illegal. Were we appropriate in doing that? I'd just to hear your reflections on that.
Go get him, Nancy.
I don't know. I think
Statute of limitations is expired on kidnapping, I'm pretty sure.
Yes.
So
I don't know, but I do. I mean, hindsight is always 2020. We have no idea what might have happened if you hadn't done that. Maybe they wouldn't have gotten so far. Maybe there were other ways. But I do think that we can tie together some things that Jamaal just said with some things that Michele said around how to change culture and how to change minds, and what some of the ways to do that. So certainly something visible like a protest or kidnapping would be very, at least visible. But what if we were to embed into whatever we do this idea of taking different perspectives, understanding? I love the idea that Jamaal just raised about, the counter narrative. And so what if instead of just protesting, Jamaal, we do not recommend kidnapping. I know, I don't recommend anyone.
Especially of any board of trustees that we are currently associated with.
That's right. Yeah, and I wouldn't surround the building if the trustees are armed. Just don't do that.
Security guards were, but anyway.
But I do think that, the nice thing about a discussion is if you've got the skills to bring in all of the viewpoints and to present the counter narrative, then you hope that eventually people will reason together. And what happened to you, Michael, is you got co-opted. I mean, you got shut down when you were no longer in the room. But that's why we set ground rules. That's why we start to talk in ways that are reasonable and we share ideas. And I don't know whether the trustees would have listened to that reasonable kind of approach.
Yeah, I want to add.
Go ahead, Michele. Yeah.
Well, I want to add a nuance. We had at UNH, we had students protesting because they wanted our trustees to divest from fossil fuels, fossil fuel related things. And one of the things that happened was there was a split in the, people working for this change, sort of the folks who were willing to work with the best actors in the worst industries. Right. So do you divest from the people who are trying to clean up the dirtiest areas, even though they're in a dirty industry, right? And so I think that is that example for me applies to so many things. Do you work with police who are working on reforms, or do you are you an abolitionist? Who do you work with to seek the change if they're inside the system, and it's a system like Brian Stevenson? He's been working in the criminal justice field around executions for years. He's in a bad system, right? And he's working with it to make change. So I think he's, anyway, I just put that out there as like, what do I do? What am I choosing to do around that? What do you do? And what choices are people making in terms of the moderate space?
But were we right or wrong, Michele?
You're right, Michael. You were right. Michael's my boss, so I have to say that. But
so Jamaal has come up with a strong anti-kidnapping position, which just to be clear, I agree. But were we right or wrong in that instance to engage in the nonviolent activity we engaged in?
I too have, well, like I said, I don't necessarily always engage in, but I have witnessed and seen and quietly rooted for takeovers of buildings, blocking off of spaces, the die-ins that were happening as a way to make things more public and to get more even, public support or at least recognition and identifying. This idea of riots or protesting, for me, what I think that they really do is they allow for conflict to arise, in which we know most people in power do not like conflict. So there are some concessions to at least mitigate, ease, pressure release some of that that's happening, which then can lead to longer sustained change. But it takes that time. I think you were absolutely right in what you did. It started, continued, ended, whatever the push towards divestment in oil industries. But then, like Michelle's talking about, it's really tricky. This is why it's not a yes or no, up or down answer. It's layered, right? We know that, let's say BP is producing the most whatever's, but they're investing the most in it. Is it okay to work with, right, inside the system versus outside the system? So yes, I think you're right. I would never advocate for kidnapping anybody. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying my official UNH position is to not.
So I do want us to get to breakouts pretty soon, but I wanted to have two things, and if we could kind of have like shortish answers to these two things. One thing that happens, and again, we did see it in the protests, the George Floyd, protests, which, were, overwhelmingly peaceful. And, my kids went to them, and, the organizers were like really trying to make them peaceful. Like the intent was peaceful, but there were people who you can't like regulate who shows up at a mass protest. And there were people who threw rocks through windows or worse, right? So bad things happen. And how do you navigate that? Like, because that's going to happen in a protest. Like you start a protest, that's going to happen. And there's going to be a backlash against that. So like, how do you navigate that risk? So anyone want to grab that one?
I'd love to go and just say that there will always be bad actors, right? There always is bad actors in most spaces that see opportunity and dive right in. What's frustrating for me about a moment or situation like that is that it's this idea that minorities and people of color are always representative of their entire, whereas majority or white people do it, it's a one-off, right? So this is where, that's to me where the root of that issue lies, is that if you, Michael, kidnap somebody for divestment in oil, it's
this was divestment from South Africa.
Got it. Well, then the Michael's got mental health issues. It's not a systemic issue. Right. If I do it, I'm representative of everybody all the time, and those people. And so that is the core for me.
January 6th was not talked about the way.
That is a very, very real thing. Okay, let me get to this one other thing, I don't know if anyone else wanted to chime in on that. No, okay. So it was something, Michelle or Nancy, I think, raised this. It's like, are there people you don't talk to, right? Mm-hmm. So let me just ask, like, are there people who are just, and what are the principles underlying? Because the three of you at least are into talking to people, and so, where do you draw the line, and what defines the line? What's the principle that underpins any lines you draw? So
my first comment is that a better person than I am would say, no, I will talk to everybody. Which is why I want to go first, because I know Michele and Jamaal are both going to be willing to talk to everybody, and they are better people. I may not be that better person. I may have some lines that I really want to draw. I mean, one line is I won't talk to somebody who's angry and has a weapon. I'm just not going to do that. That's just stupid. I also don't want to talk to anybody who challenges my right to talk or be there. And that's just an exercise in futility. There's no sense in doing that. So maybe I'm a little bit of a pragmatist. I don't want to get killed and I don't want to get ignored. But I will say that the problem with my stance, the problem with disengaging, is that it is a form of self-censorship. And it does leave room for perpetuation of the status quo. If I don't stay at the table and don't talk and don't make my case. But boy, I want to stand with solidarity with a lot of people around some of the issues facing this nation right now. And so I'm very challenged by this question.
One thing I do, like Bill Maddock, there was a question in the chat about what our opinions were about a far-right speaker being, I guess, shut down, who's going to appear in Dartmouth. And I would say one criteria I have is I don't want to speak to people if it would empower, like, I don't want to speak to extremists if it would give them more power for me to speak to them. So, I mean, this isn't me, but if I'm, I don't think that Joe Biden should be meeting with white supremacists, aside, like maybe Michelle can, or someone else can, or you guys, or we can, someone can, but like that would just elevate that person and give them more power, because it legitimizes them just by the act of talking, meeting with them, legitimizes them. And I'm the director of a school of public policy. I don't know whether anyone cares if I meet with him, but I certainly wouldn't want the president of this university to meet with a white supremacist, because that would legitimize something that I think doesn't deserve, like, it gives them more power. And I don't want to do that. So that's one thing I want to throw in there. So Michele, I jumped in and I'm taking time now, but maybe Michele and Jamaal quickly on this, and then I want to get to one.
Well, I just want to make a distinction that has been helpful for me, and that is, if the president meets with white supremacists, he has given them systemic legitimacy because of where he sits. And so for me, if I meet with someone, who's a white supremacist, assuming I'm not president at the time, or in some kind of other, positional power, it doesn't grant the systemic legitimacy. And so then I have to decide, what is the opportunity, and I'm going to dial back a little bit from, people who want to kill people. There's a lot of things we disagree about in the United States. And, we always have, we always will. Is there anyone I won't talk to? And why would I talk to them? And so, like, for me, there's, I already mentioned Brian Stevenson and proximity. Jonathan Haidt talks about, the only cure for bias is other people. I believe that. I mean, I believe people need to talk. So no one person has to talk to everybody, but somebody does. And depending on where you are and what's going on, I hope there's always at least someone who will talk to any other human, regardless of who they are and what they're doing and what they're espousing. Because then we've just, we've used the master's tools in the master's house, and we're dehumanizing those people when you're hoping there's a bridge back to humanity. And that won't happen if humans won't talk to them.
Okay, Jamaal.
Yeah, I fall in a weird spectrum of this, because I don't think that not talking to somebody delegitimizes their reality and perception. I don't know that disengaging always sends forth the message that we want. And I know I made the example when talking before about playing the lotto. I will never win the lotto, but I know I'll never win if I don't play, right? So it's this, if you don't engage, there will most likely never be any kind of change, much less systemic change. If you do engage, you run the risk of legitimizing and making these people seem as though they have a seat at the table. But the truth is, they have a seat at their own table. And if we don't engage them, where are we going for change? How do we change when we're actively ignoring people in the room? That doesn't always work. And I don't have a concrete idea, I'm thinking about North Korea. Do I think it was right that Trump met him and gave him legitimacy? No, not at all. But do I think that it's right that we ignore them as though they aren't major actors in the social political context? No, I don't think that's right either. I don't know what the answer is. And I don't know that every meeting is the same. I think Joe Biden could meet with white supremacists and be very vocal going into it, be very vocal during, be very vocal afterwards, and then not seem as though he is inviting them to the larger table or under the tent. I don't know where the right course of action is. I just know that not engaging at all will never get us anywhere that we want to for systemic long-term change. So again, I'm still circling the airport, haven't quite landed, don't know, just blah, blah, blah.
I'm going to do the last, I'm going to get to the last thing I wanted to touch on. Excuse me. Need a cough button. I apologize. I lost my voice.
All right. Tutti to rescue.
Does context matter? Like on a college campus versus something else?
Context always matters for everything. And as we're talking about these engaging with people, who do we engage with or not? I'm thinking about the context of my own personal identity, my family, where I live. I'm in a small town in Ware, New Hampshire, where they went through 2/3 for Trump. We've got active Go Brandon flags and F Biden flags regularly. So me sticking my neck out in this context, probably not going to happen because I want to go to my nice quiet home in the woods and be able to enjoy. If I am living in a city, does it matter a little bit less in that moment? For me, yes, but context, time, place, all of that to me matters.
Nancy, I can talk again, which may not be a good thing, but it's a thing.
Well, I absolutely agree with Jamaal. Context matters. And I think your question was about the campus.
Yeah.
And I think that it really matters on a college campus because our mission is learning and research, scholarship, the search for truth. And if we can't challenge speech that is untruthful, I don't know where it's going to happen. I think it has to happen on a college campus. I am not an absolutist when it comes to First Amendment rights. I do not believe that the quad is the same as the public square. I don't believe that academic freedom only applies in the classroom. I think based on our research and 30 years of research, we know that learning happens campus-wide. And I do believe that all students have a legal right to fair and equal learning. So I think that we have more power than we exercise. I'm very tired of these statements that are issued from institutional leadership saying, well, we abhor what that person said, but there's nothing we can do about it. I'm sorry, I don't buy that. But I think that's why we have academic freedom. And if we don't do something about it, we actually relinquish our academic freedom. But I get it. I don't think that sending people underground or having them shut down their viewpoints is going to do very much good. And so in the end, I might be more inclined to engage with, meet bad speech with good speech. But I would also, if I thought, let's put it this way, if campuses were entertaining jihadist recruiters, they would be shut down in a heartbeat. Mm-hmm. So why are we entertaining white nationalist recruiters? I think it comes down to who has power, who makes those decisions. And I want the academy to get a spine and do a little bit more, a lot more.
Can I just quickly follow up on that? I didn't quite follow part of what you were saying, which was you were sort of saying sort of getting a spine you were equating with being academic freedom. Could you just flesh that out a little bit? Like, why is getting a spine and not allowing certain types of people on campus, why is that academic freedom?
Because academic freedom is an institutional right. It's not an individual right. Yes, there are contractual obligations that might be incorporated into a faculty contract based on some relationship with the AAUP or something like that, but that's not really the heart and soul of academic freedom. It's really a social contract. And what it says is that higher education is going to do research and going to educate for a strong democracy. And there's lots of old language about that. But in order to fulfill that mission, they have to have academic freedom to make tough choices. And so I'm saying that they have more academic freedom, that the term academic freedom has been co-opted and isn't living up to its intent. And so that's why I think academic freedom gives us a spine if we choose to use it.
I have to think about that more. That was interesting. So Michele, should we, are we ready for breakout rooms, I think?
Yeah, sure. We know that some people just want to lurk in conversations like this, but I also just want to encourage people to say yes when you're invited into the small groups. It seems to me the thing that I hope some of you will talk about is, what did this conversation make you reflect on in terms of your own role in your life, your organization, the things you're passionate about? I think, someone posted earlier, we need all kinds in a social change movement. What parts feel right or wrong for you, and what parts feel right or wrong regardless, right? So would love to give you about 20 minutes to talk with your neighbors, and then we want to come back, hear some thoughts from all of you, and then do a little wrap up. So just a quick 20 minutes with about 5 or 6 people in groups, and I believe Nick is gonna open those breakouts.
Can I just suggest we make it 15 given the timing?
Oh, yeah, we can do that. 15 minutes.
Yep.
Plot back in. So I think folks are rejoining us now, and we have a new little member with us. So we know that was fast, and that you were in some small groups, but I would love to invite a couple of things. One, if there's just a thought or an insight or something that stuck with you in your conversation that you want to add to chat, please do. And also we'll just take a minute or two to just do some final thoughts from the panel. I'll pass it to Michael, but would love to know if there's a couple of folks who want to share a thought. We'll read through a few of those in chat, and I think you can unmute and turn your cameras on now too, so hopefully folks will feel free to do that. All right.
Should we kind of go around the horn here, and we can jump in as people gather any thoughts they might want to share. So I don't know, Michele, you want to start?
This conversation has felt more selfish for me in the sense that I feel as a professional, in the dialogue space, that I have to hold my feet to the fire of really paying attention to when dialogue is being asked for, so that it's not used to silence people, which is a paradox. I think that can happen. I also think, that it takes all kinds, and I'm glad that there are people who will talk to people that maybe I might not talk to. So that's my takeout, and I think Monty should go next.
Well, can I just say, I wanted to highlight something Bruce Mallory just raised in the chat, which, he brings up. We've kind of focused in on protest versus dialogue, and he's pointing out, organizing. I mean, I think that's like a good point. And, it sort of connects that we touched on voting with Nancy, and you know, and there's to organizing to what, right? I mean, sometimes you're organizing a protest, sometimes you're organizing to vote, sometimes you're organizing, you know, all sorts of advocacy, letter writing. I mean, there's all sorts of ways, you know, that are somewhere in the dialogue, voting, protest continuum.
Yeah.
So I want to pose something that everybody's going to say, oh gosh, Nancy, we need another hour. What about education? What about education as a catalyst for social change? How are we doing on that? Is that the job? So I agree with Bruce, you know, there are lots of ways to do this, and certainly community organizing. But one of the things that we found in our research was that educating students for leadership and social change increased engagement. And I think that we should be thinking of education as a part of the solution to, and part of the puzzle of how do you effectuate social change.
Yeah.
And
Here,
how do
here.
you do that in a world in which we are banning books from libraries and discussions on race, right? How do both of those operate at the same time?
You
I do
invoke academic freedom with a spine.
Yes, absolutely. Because again, I live in a small area where we are actively banning books. We are anti-CRT, even though I didn't know about CRT till my second or third year in graduate school. Do not make my white child feel any kind of way about anything. They are not to feel guilt or shame or understand. And what we're doing is fine. And then this is where counter narratives has its home. This is where it has its place to, you know, to not to dehumanize the majority, but to humanize those that have been so viciously silenced over generations.
Yeah.
I-
Yeah, I think, you know, I just, and maybe Michael, you can take us out on this one. I mean, I think everything we're talking about has to end up in some kind of public policy that fosters, or, you know, that helps in some way, right? That we hope good things will happen. I'm curious about that part of the sausage making.
Well, I'll just close up by saying it does. I mean, although if someone wants to disagree with me, they can chime in. But you know, it does sort of come back to the power point, and you know, I mean, it's probably not every single thing does it end up being an issue of someone in authority has to take an action. That's certainly not true, but in a lot of things, a lot of kinds of change, ultimately you need that. And so the question is, you either change the people who have the authority, you know, which we have elections and we do that, or you know, use the various kinds of power you might have to, you know, force, compel, make in their best interest the people with authority to make change, to take the actions you want. And, you know, or you persuade them. I mean, there's, you know, and so, you know, it kind of comes down to that. And it's strategizing and thinking through, how do you make those kinds of things? How do you make people in authority take action? So I think that's kind of what we've been trying to get at one way or another throughout this. And, you know, Nancy's absolutely right. I mean, educating people so that people know how to do that, and how to, and you know, just sort of understand the context, which was sort of Jamaal was hitting, but, you know, on like, there's a historic context to all of this. In any given movement, there's a historic context. So, and, you know, we got to do something so that everything turns out right for him.
I think
All
that's
right.
a great way to end.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I hope you enjoyed it, and yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Nancy. Thanks for being here, folks.